Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2. Today we're going to cover audit evidence, and we are also going to cover fraud. We're going to kick it off right now with audit evidence. And as soon as Sue dials in, which we expect any moment here, we will start that off. Just as a reminder that it's December 7th that we are going to be having a virtual meeting. So please mark your calendars there.
Let's see. Jim, do we know what time that is? Yeah.
Is it 7 a.m.? I don't know quite yet. We'll look it up.
It is
7.
7 for now, but we're still drafting the agenda.
Yeah, we're still finalizing.
That's a week.
I think it's we're in holding pattern at the moment, pending our speaker. All right, we will proceed. Sue, it's very nice to see you. Welcome to the CAG.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Jim.
I'm
Apologies.
going to turn it over to you if you're ready.
Yeah, if you just bear with me a second. Apologies. I think as we changed some of the timings around, I got my timings a little bit off. So we're good.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody, and appreciate the opportunity to come back again on audit evidence. So you have the papers that we prepared, and you've obviously seen the details of the staff who've done a lot of the work in the background. I think Colleen is in the room with you, and Ida, and the support we've had from Dan and Billy. And obviously you've got the details of the task force of Greg, Eric, Ada, and myself. And I just want to highlight the ongoing coordination that we've had with other task forces, particularly fraud, with IAASB, and of course with the consultation groups, particularly technology, in the as we progressed on the drafting for ED 500 in the last quarter. It's probably worth highlighting before I go into some of the detail that the audit evidence discussion was originally scheduled for December to allow the task force to progress with analysing the feedback and developing responses to the feedback that we had on the exposure draft. But because there were commonalities in the feedback with the strategy and work plan consultation, particularly in areas such as technology, it did make sense for both to be presented to the board in September. So as a result, although we will discuss a number of the key issues, and I'm very pleased with the progress we've made so far, not all of the themes from the feedback that we had on the exposure have been discussed in depth with the task force to date. And of course, we will continue our work post-September. And of course, as you're aware, the board has only just had the papers, and we haven't had an opportunity to discuss our proposals with the board yet. So if I can have the next slide, please. So what you have here is a summary of the responses that we've had so far, or that we've had on ED 500. We received 70 written comment letters from all geographical regions, and you can see the breakdown of the responses there. We had responses from 2 monitoring group members, IFIAR and IOSCO. We've had responses from regulators, national standard setters, firms, networks, public sector organisations, professional organisations, and from individuals. So I think you can see a very broad representative feedback. Next slide, please. What we've done here is provide a bit of a heat map of the feedback that we've had to give a kind of visualization where we've had support or lack of support on certain themes. There's kind of traffic light system, so the green colours are support, the yellow is a kind of conditional support or qualified support, and orange is where there's mixed views or less in the way of agreement. As you can see on the slide there was broad support for the principle-based approach in ED 500 and as an overarching standard addressing the auditor's responsibilities relating to audit evidence, including for its nature and role as a foundational standard within the suite of ISAs. In addition, there was support for the revisions that would enhance auditor judgment and lead to the reinforced application of professional scepticism in obtaining and evaluating audit evidence. At an overarching level, stakeholders commented that more clarity is needed for the work effort and documentation expectations and for some of the scalability aspects included in the proposals. Those themes were cross-cutting across a number of the areas in ED 500 and usually linked to the exercise of professional judgment. In addition, the respondents believe that there's more needed in ED 500 to fully achieve the objective of modernisation with respect to technology. And at the same time, the respondents recognise that the revisions to ED 500 alone are not sufficient to address all the audit evidence related matters across the suite of ISAs, including those technology. And I'm conscious you had the session on the strategy and work plan yesterday, and have already looked at some of the feedback here that comes across both the strategy and in relation to ED 500. Next slide, please. So looking at some of the themes, just drilling down a little bit further into some of those areas that were on that heat map. The purpose and scope, the feedback on here, broad support for the principle-based framework and the linkages to the other ISAs. There were some views that the principles may be set too high, and that maybe more specificity for the requirements and all the guidance may be needed to support consistency. There were comments about the duplication with ISA 330, particularly in relation to the standback requirements, and suggestions to address audit evidence matters more holistically across the suite of ISAs. And as I say, that's common with the feedback that we had on the strategy and work plan. Next slide, please. So in relation to the feedback on enhanced auditor judgment, again, as you can see on the slide, there was broad support that the enhancements will collectively enhance auditor judgment. But there were requests for more clarity about what auditors are expected to do differently in practice and how audit quality will be improved, and some suggestions there for additional guidance. There were comments that more clarity could be provided for matters in ED 500 where there is the exercise of professional judgment, and that included concerns about uncertainty about the work effort, what the auditor is expected to document, how auditors may interpret how regulators may interpret some of these matters as well. And there were comments from some respondents about a perception of a more extensive documentation burden that may lead to over-documentation and may promote checklist type approaches. Next slide, please. In relation to professional scepticism, as you can see from the slide, there were broad support for the enhancements with some further suggestions, as you would expect, for areas where improvements could be made. Next slide, please. On the balance of requirements and application material, as we've highlighted here, there were some mixed views here on whether ED 500 achieves the appropriate balance of application material and requirements. And you will see as I go through into some of the other areas that this is probably the first area where we started to see slightly more polarized views. So where we say there are mixed views, there are some who would like to see more requirements, there were some who would like to see less. So it's quite a split on the feedback there. But there were also support for streamlining the application material and providing more robust examples. Next slide, please. So starting to get into perhaps some of the more tricky areas, or the areas that elicited more feedback, and technology, I know, as I say, you have already looked at in relation to the strategy and work plan. And as we've described on the slide, there were mixed views on technology. There was broad recognition that more is needed, both in ED 500, but also, as you've already heard, in other standards, to address the evolution in technology. And there was an encouragement from a number of respondents to look at a more holistic approach across the standards to the IAASB's approach to technology. Next slide, please. So the task force has met since we had the feedback, and it was only about 2 or 3 weeks ago, so it's incredible how much we've managed to get through in that time. And we have a number of proposals that we will be putting to the board next week. So the current proposals in ED 500, it's probably worth highlighting that they are developed in the context of the project scope, which was relatively narrow in some respects, because it specifically excluded enhancements to ISA 330 and other ISOs from the 500 series. And it also had a narrower scope, focus on technology enhancements. So with that in mind, we are probably unable to achieve what some of the respondents are looking for. But recognising those constraints, not all of the matters from the feedback can be addressed within the current scope of the project, but we are able to make an indication of areas that we think we can address within the current project. What the task force has also done has been to make a preliminary identification of the matters that we've had from the feedback, looking at where and how the technology related topics from the feedback may be addressed, both within ED 500 and outside, because I think that will inform the discussion that we will have both on 500 and also in relation to the strategy and work plan. That analysis is in the issues paper, which you have access to and will be discussed by the board in September. And we think it's important for the board to consider those matters within the wider scope of the feedback, because it is reflective of the thoughts that people have about where technology could be addressed within the standards. So that said, the Audit Evidence Task Force does believe that more can be done in ED 500 to address technology, given the views that more specificity is needed and the calls for feedback to undertake some more robust actions to modernise ED 500 for technology. So we have got some proposals in relation to 500 that we will be discussing with the board, and those include, firstly, a principles-based conditional requirement for when the auditor uses audit automated tools and techniques, so ATT. Important to say that the conditional requirement doesn't mandate the use of ATT, but probably very similar to the requirement that we have at the moment for using information prepared by a management's expert. It only applies when the auditor uses that support. So when the auditor uses ATT, there are conditional requirements, and that looks at the appropriateness of the inputs to the automated tool and technique, and whether they are relevant, reliable, and also looking at whether the ATT operates as designed and whether its outputs meet the purpose for which it's intended. Again, a similarity with what we have in other conditional requirements. The task force believes that could be an effective approach that would help to build consistent practice, and it is consistent with some of the stakeholder feedback that we've had both on ED 500 and the strategy consultation. That conditional requirement, also perhaps just to highlight it, we think it complements the requirements that are currently in ISQM 1 and ISO 220 revised for the use of technological resources. And of course, we would develop additional application material to support any such requirement. So that's probably a proposal that we'll be looking at next week, and obviously interested in your feedback. The other proposals we have, or some of them here, are the proposal to describe ATT. In doing so, what we would do is only name certain specific technologies, things like AI and robotics. There has been feedback to be more specific. The balancing act that we're having to do as a task force is be conscious of the fact that standards have quite a lifetime, and what we might define or include as examples now may be seen as very dated in 5 or 10 years time. And you're probably aware that we have examples of things like faxes in current material, and so it dates the material. So we're looking at perhaps naming things but not going into too much detail. The other piece about describing rather than defining is that it allows more flexibility for potential updates as conforming amendments when other standards are updated. So that's the proposal there. And we would also intend to enhance the examples and application material, obviously engaging with the technology consultation group to discuss what we can provide both within the standards and also by way of non-authoritative guidance to support the application and implementation of ED 500 in specific areas. Next slide, please. So, Jim, I was going to pause there and ask for feedback from the CAG on the technology area. I'm conscious I probably summarised that, but you probably have more material in the papers, and also it follows on from the discussion that you had yesterday as part of the work programme.
Thanks, Sue. And let me ask the CAG, any comments on the technology area? I see hand, Mike.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks very much for the presentation. Even pre-COVID, with the amount of use of automated or ATT types of items and things of that nature, being able to review clients' files and test journal entries, things of that nature, but even now complicated with remote auditing, I think this is spot on. I think this is the place where there could be the most issue in an audit failure. And I am very pleased with the fact that the task force has identified some of these areas, identified guidance, and I'm fully supportive of what is being proposed.
Thank you, Mike. Akihito.
Thank you, James. So thank you very much for your presentation. Very helpful for me to update. I generally agree with principle-based approach for revising ISA 500. However, in terms of technology area, which is one of the important themes in the project proposal, I have a thought. Developing guidance in a timely manner is crucial. At this moment, innovative technology used in audit, such as remote observation tools, performing recalculation procedures on 100% of populations, and use of data analysis to perform risk assessment or substantive procedures are developing and will be developing rapidly in the future. Because of the using new technology, it does not necessarily covered and read appropriately by principle-based standards. So there are risks of fragmentation in audit practice. There are various areas to which auditors require guidance. However, technology-related guidance must be top prioritized, given it is a new and evolving area, I believe. Also, I expect IAASB to continue to coordinate with IAASB closely. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akihito. Christian.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Sue, for your presentation. Allow me just a quick general comment on Accountancy Europe's view, because Accountancy Europe has asked from the very beginning on for a principle-based standard. And we unfortunately need to realize that after all the consultations, this objective has apparently not been met. With respect to this question here, we actually fully agree that the use of technology or automated tools and technologies is not sufficiently addressed in ISA 500 ED. We agree that this needs to be addressed and also being addressed in a holistic manner. So in ISA 500 and other relevant standards related to this topic, if this cannot be achieved or done in this project, it will most likely mean that this ISA 500 will need to be reopened soon again in our view. So if requirements are included in the ISAs, they indeed need to be conditional, but the main need will be practical guidance and examples for auditors. That's our point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Conchita.
Thank you. Um, Thank you for the presentation. Overall, I agree to, or our group agrees to the findings or whatever had been called from the survey or discussion. I would like to reiterate that technology, the developments in technology is so robust that its applications may not be the way we are discussing it now, the basis of which may no longer be current. And therefore, this has to be addressed. It's so fast the way they develop the tools and the applications. Perhaps I agree to some of the comments that there is a need to enhance the guidance and the examples. And this is not static, and it becomes therefore a continuing task to be sensitive to technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. And we're having a little trouble hearing you, so if you could speak a little louder next time, I think that might help solve that problem. Barb, you're up next.
Thanks, Jim. One comment and then maybe one question for Sue. I mean, I'm a big proponent of keeping standards as principles-based as possible, especially when it comes to kind of a keystone or foundational standard like audit evidence. But Sue, I would be interested if there's anything you could share for people who suggest it should more specifically address technology. Did you get specific suggestions for how it would do so?
Thanks, Barb. And Greg.
Yes, thanks, Jim. I just want to echo the comments received so far. Fully support the comments of my colleagues. This topic is critical to the relevance of this standard. And I just wanted to note that the same topic is relevant to other standards that are either under development or have been developed, such as direct reporting engagements, sustainability assurance, less complex engagements. And it's important that the guidance and requirements be consistent wherever possible or expected if an audit engagement is being performed, because to the extent the requirement or guidance is inconsistent, that will impair the understandability of any of those 4 or 5 input sources to the application of standards. So the moment you have one standard that either uses previous terminology or extant terminology, and it is in effect, and you have another standard that perhaps reflects more current thinking, there's a risk that auditors will not fully understand or apply their understanding from another standard in the execution of another engagement. So that would just be one other perspective to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Galen?
Thank you, Jim. I think I agree with most of what I heard from the other representatives. I believe that, and I'm looking at the recommendations, the scope of the project, not all feedback can be addressed. I think that would be an important principle here, because this area is constantly changing. And that's why I think the principle-based approach is important. I'm a little bit unclear about, in my mind anyway, about enhancing the guidance and examples, because that doesn't always go hand in hand with principles-based, and especially when you have a fast-moving area, they'd be constantly updating this. So I wonder if non-authoritative staff guidance might be a better place for that can periodically be addressed without having to go through all the standard setting processes So I guess that is where I see that. But overall, I really believe that this that the task force is on the right path here with these recommendations. I agree with Mike that I think this is spot on. Thank you.
Thanks, Galen. I think examples are very hard in standards because they end up becoming the de facto. Let's see. Any other hands on this particular aspect? All right, Sue, I think you got quite a bit of feedback. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. I did wonder whether we could just stop after Mike's comment about being spot on. That was a lovely start. I think I was going to. I think Galen, you summarised the challenge that we're dealing with very well at the end there, because the more we build into guidance and examples, the more it potentially undermines the principles, and the other piece is that it also potentially dates what we have. So that we have got some good material from the technology working group that is already there as non-authoritative guidance, and that we think we can draw on further for examples that will be a bit more specific than what we had, but that will have a time frame. But that is exactly the challenge that we're dealing with. And I'm just looking through the notes. Barb, you asked about whether people had provided suggestions for specific suggestions on technology, and it's a kind of a yes and no answer. Yes, there were suggestions, but when we look at them, a lot of them are very specific and probably either over detailed for a place in a standard, or they are looking at current technology. And several of you that commented were talking about the speed of development and things here, and so they were that we might need to take them up a level from what we've been asked to be able to give them to make sure that they are useful. So yes, there are some, and we're obviously working through that. And going back to what I said about how we probably had to advance some of our work, we've not had the opportunity to go through a lot of the detail there. What we wanted to do on this meeting with the board is to really drill down on the approach to technology, and if we get that kind of general support for some of the things we're talking about, then we'll go through the work through and try and make sure that we pull out the key things. Jim, I think that's probably pulled out the main piece of the feedback there. If you're happy, I'll probably continue with the presentation, if that's okay.
Yes, please continue.
Thank you. Okay, can I get, oh look, Michelle's a mind reader. So just moving on to some of the next pieces. The definition of audit evidence. So just summarising the feedback here, we had support there for the theoretical relevance of the input-output model, and we will address. We'll obviously address that in the application material as well. There was suggestions for clarity about what constitutes a necessary audit procedure to turn information into audit evidence, and there were comments around the scope of the definition. There is a possibility to read this as creating a sort of like a perpetual loop in certain circumstances if there's inconsistencies in their evidence, because you keep needing to have to go back in the through the definition. So some good suggestions there. Next slide, please. On sufficiency, appropriateness and persuasiveness, there was support for including the concept of persuasiveness in ED 500 with some views and suggestions that perhaps more is needed. Another example of where we had quite differing feedback with some suggestions that it should be a definition, or that persuasiveness should be elevated to the requirements, or that there should be more guidance about how much audit evidence is enough. Next slide, please. On relevance and reliability, there was support for the enhancements in relation to evaluating relevance and reliability of information, although there were some comments around clarity of the documentation that might be needed, and some people expressed a concern about the step up in the work requirement from consider to evaluate. So there were suggestions about more clarity on documentation expectations and the spectrum of work that's needed to evaluate relevance and reliability, and also suggestions about work effort on authenticity of information. There were some views as well that more robust requirements are needed to evaluating the information prepared by a management's expert. You'll recall that we think that the principles are established, and then management's expert is an example of applying the principles. But obviously, that's something that some respondents had some comments on. Next slide, please. This is probably our biggest example of divergent views. So this, as you can see on the slide, we had mixed views on the conditional requirement for accuracy and completeness. We either had concerns that this is describing a less robust approach compared to what we have with the extant standard, or that the robust approach that we have by outlining all the attributes is diminishing the importance of other attributes of relevance and reliability. There were also concerns about the ability of the requirement the ability to comply with the requirement for some sources that might be external to the information to the entity. So that was the key feedback there. Next slide, please. So this is an area that we've spent some time looking at and just debating some possibilities. So we've looked at a number of the areas I've just gone through and summarised. So on the definition, we are proposing to retain the definition that is in ED 500, but to develop more application material to clarify the definition and to address some of the scalability aspects. On sufficiency, appropriateness, and persuasiveness, proposal is to define persuasiveness of audit evidence and then to streamline and enhance the application material. On relevance and reliability, we are proposing to clarify the threshold for the attributes to refer to the attribute being significant in the circumstances. And we think that will help address this kind of perpetual loop concern. And we would also explore clarifying the documentation expectations. Next slide, please. So on the task force views and recommendations on the conditional requirement for accuracy and completeness, we are presenting two options to the board in September. We have two that we think will address some of the feedback, but given that we are dealing with different perspectives, I suspect it might be hard to please everybody on this one. So option one is to remove paragraph 10, which is the conditional requirement for completeness and accuracy, and I add essential material to the requirement in paragraph 9 to explain that accuracy and completeness are ordinarily significant attributes for information from sources that are internal to the entity. So that's essentially explaining that the existing requirement is still covered by the paragraph 9. The other option, option 2, is to replace paragraph 10, so to replace the conditional requirement for completeness and accuracy with a new requirement to obtain audit evidence about accuracy and completeness for information from sources internal to the entity supported by essential material. So that is essentially going back to what we have in extant. The audit evidence task force views are explained in the issues paper. We do believe that option 1 aligns more closely with the principle-based approach, as it doesn't impose a requirement that is based on the source of the information, and it also promotes the thinking about all the relevant attributes in the circumstances. And as I said, we think it addresses the circularity that's been fed back. On the other hand, option 2 does retain the existing requirement to obtain audit evidence for accuracy and completeness from information produced by the entity, and may be seen by some as a more robust approach. So, as I say, those are the 2 options. We're looking at whether we retain or whether we go for the more principles-based approach, or whether we retain something that is more specific in certain instances. So, if we could have the next slide, please. And obviously, this is an area that we are particularly interested in your feedback on in the conditional requirement. So, Jim, back to you.
Thanks, Sue. And you're looking for guidance on option 1 or option 2 then? Okay.
Yes, please.
Jean, would you like to kick this one off?
Sure. We support option 2. We are concerned with option 1 with the use of the word ordinarily could be perceived as inherently optional. And so given the importance, our perceived importance of the completeness and accuracy of this information, we think option 2 would be a better approach.
Thank you, Jean. Christian?
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for the 2 options presented. I think overall we are very supportive of the initial views and recommendations. We're struggling with option 2, to be honest, Jen. The reason is because it refers to the auditor to obtain audit evidence, whereas it should be the auditor performs audit procedures to avoid an infinitum of evaluation. And there's another point to the input-output approach, because that might become very burdensome or overburdensome and becoming a more tick-the-box exercise instead of really, getting to the point where we say maybe guidance is really needed on what constitute audit procedures to become information into audit evidence. So that process, that needs to be documented to make sure we're getting to the point. So that is the view of the Council Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Conchita, and if remember to speak directly into your mic.
Yes, thank you. We'll go for option 2. Thank you.
Option 2. Thank you, Conchita. Paul?
Well, I'm going to make it 2-all. With EFA is agreeable. Our preliminary view is aligned with Accountancy Europe on this. The option 1 is the preferred for the reasons that Christian has explained.
See, we may have a tiebreaker here. I'm looking for anyone else who has a view on. Galen, I see you're reaching for your card.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree with IAASB on this one. I think option 1 would be the one that I would support. I think they're both worthy of consideration, but for the reason that John pointed out. I wanted to go back, I think it was to slide 13, where it's talking about relevance and reliability and the consideration of evaluate or consider which path is the appropriate path to go. And I think whenever you're dealing with anything of significance, auditors should be evaluating. And I think that's a higher bar than considering. Considering doesn't really get me very far as a standard setter. So I wondered whether Sue would weigh in on maybe that comment.
And Galen, just for clarification, do you mean option 2? Because I think that's what IAASB was.
I think I was on option 1. Then I mixed it up. I agree with what John said.
Yeah, so we think option 1 is a little problematic.
You're right.
So we're
It was
supportive
option
of
2.
option 2.
It was option 2.
So Sue, we have an option 2 from Galen. Barb?
I prefer option 2, but I wouldn't say that option 1 is not workable. I think that maybe the task force should consider, regulatory expectations. And so if you go with an ordinarily should, I think regulators will interpret that as a should. So maybe just take that under consideration as you move forward.
That's really parsing out words when you're saying ordinarily should versus just a should. That might be something to consider. Mike?
I would echo Galen as well. Option 2, I think, is the best choice. And I also agree with him in terms of making sure that you consider, the evidence as opposed to, or evaluate the evidence, I think is very important to have in the final standard.
Thank you, Mike. Greg?
Thank you. So I'm looking for an option result that is less open to interpretation. So based on what was presented, option 2 is the most direct to me. And one of the experiences I have with this issue is that non-professional accountants providing services to audit teams are also referring to this standard. And therefore, the more direct we are in the way it's authored, the more likely it is to be understood by all as intended. So I would just encourage, no matter the conclusion on the options, that the language be precise and be understandable and not subject to interpretation.
Thanks, Greg. Natasha?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I would totally agree with what Greg just said. And from an investor perspective, I think option 2 is the better one. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. I do think having the concise wording makes it much easier for practitioners. Sue, I don't see any more cards. Mike, your hand's up, but I'm not sure if that was from last time. Okay, Sue, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I think the feedback probably aligns with the comment letters we've had from a number of the people that are here. So I certainly recognise the feedback, and I think there's some suggestions there for us to think about the language in particular. And I just wanted to come back on Galen's comments about the consider and evaluate, because that is an area where we are conscious that there is an expectation really that has been enhanced, and so it's probably not a surprise that some will kind of feel that, but I think that was a very early decision by the board, and I don't think we've looked to change that in any way. So I would hope that will continue to follow through. Okay, so if I move on the presentation, so just coming back into what about another area about sort of mixed views areas here. So this is the stand back requirement. So this was something where we had mixed views here and concerns about whether this duplicates the work effort in ISO 330. So we had suggestions as to whether we could optimize the various standbacks across the ISAs to increase their effectiveness, and whether we could, or whether we broaden the scope of this standback to explicitly address all information. So it's a case of whether we take it out or whether we enhance it. So next slide, please. The task force has looked at this. We actually reviewed the various standbacks in the ISAs because there are a number in various standards. So we included those in 500 and in ED 570, and we believe that there are benefits in retaining the paragraph 13A of 500, which is the evaluation as to whether the evidence whether evidence obtained meets the intended purpose of the procedures, because that closes the loop in what's currently in paragraph 8B, which is the requirement to design and perform audit procedures that provides audit evidence to meet the purpose of the audit procedures. So our proposal there is to refocus the requirement here in the context of ED 500. So it's I think we probably need to stop using the word standback here, because it's more a closing the loop on what we set out to do. So to focus it in the context of 500 rather than looking at whether sufficient appropriate evidence has been obtained as required in 330. So we acknowledge as well that if it is retained, the level at which the requirement is performed, and we currently say it's at the audit procedure level, will need to be further considered and addressed. We acknowledge the concerns about the overlap of the standback in paragraph 13B with the standback in 330, which is all about considering whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. And when we did the analysis of the various standbacks in the standards, we didn't identify particular gaps. So on that basis, our initial thinking is that the standback in 13B, we recommend that that's removed, and the paragraph 13A, which is the closing the loop piece, should be retained. So that's our proposals on the standback requirements. And Jim, I think the next slide is a question for the CAG, just to ask for any further views on that, the proposals, the feedback on the standback and the proposals that we have. So if I can have the next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, it's interesting, the standbacks. We've had a proliferation of standbacks in the standards. I think it's a reaction to this whole concept that maybe the auditors aren't looking at the bigger picture. They're very focused on the detail. I mean, maybe it's an element of professional skepticism, but I understand why there's a sense that we need those, but I also understand there's a lot, we're getting a lot of standbacks in a lot of different areas. So we do have some comments. Christian?
Jim, first of all, I want to echo your comment. I think you're absolutely right. It is necessary to have the standback. The only thing where we really need to be cautious to have too many standbacks on too many levels, because the aim is to get the big picture. So again, I think you're on spot saying we need the standback, but we have to be cautious with overloading this with too many standbacks. It becomes a tick the box exercise again, and that's what we want to avoid. So that said, yes, we would agree to the requirement, and we also would agree to delete paragraph 13B.
Okay, so one agreement for the requirement and one deletion to 13B. Jean?
Thank you, Sue. This is a difficult project with a lot of tough issues, but we are supportive of the proposed approach. We think it's a good outcome. It will eliminate some of the duplication between 500 and 330. So we are supportive.
Thank you, Jean. Wei?
Oh, thanks, Jane. Thanks Sue's presentation, high-level overview of public comments and update of the proposals. As I mentioned in last September CAG meeting, I support to introduce 13B into the draft. I noticed that Sue said the task force proposal to remove this requirement due to its overlap with ISA 330. I think the discussion made by the task force is very in-depth and fruitful, as it shows in agenda item G2. I'm supportive of those discussions pointed out in paragraph 169 in agenda. I recognize there is some overlap. As far as I understand, the emphasis here is to consider all audit evidence obtained, no matter whether that is consistent or inconsistent with other audit evidence. So in my view, this requirement will change audit behavior in concluding whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained in the long run. And this requirement may not be misinterpreted, I think. The inconsistency should be the auditor should pay more attention to the inconsistency, and the auditor should explain the inconsistency and how to address that in the documentation. So from my perspective, ISA 500 is a specified standard targeted for audit evidence, which should include important requirements for considering and evaluating audit evidence. So I do not support to delete that one. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. Conchita.
Thank you. Overall, I agree with the task force on what is ahead. There is a need for more clarifications and the removal of paragraph 13B, considering the fact that it has an overlap with ISA 330. We have a lot of work to do ahead. So my best wishes to the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. Galen.
Thank you, Jim. So I support the task force recommendations. I think they've hit the mark here. And to Christian, and I think your point, Jim, there is a proliferation of standback requirements, and I'm not sure that they're always needed. If it's in 330 on the what is it, the overall assessment, that stand back takes place and it's focused on audit evidence, and audit evidence is the core of the audit as far as I'm concerned. So I really do think that almost every aspect of decision making, whether you're talking about auditing or accounting, anything else, people tend to take a stand back because they don't want to be lost in the trees of the forest and without seeing the forest. So yeah, I support the recommendations that were presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. Natasha.
Thank you. Yes, I likewise think it's really important that we retain that stand back requirement. I guess I have actually a quick question, if I may, which is there evidence or statistics on the number of times that stand back requirement is actually lent upon and leads to a change in view?
Thank you, Natasha. Anyone else? Sue, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. So I think there we're more on the supporting removing 13B, so that's very helpful. With some cautions and Wei Meng, I'm very conscious of the piece you said about the taking account of consistent, inconsistent evidence. We think that's emphasised, but that's definitely something that we will be keeping in mind as we work on whatever way forward the board directs. Natasha, that's a fantastic question, and I wish I had an answer. I think, I mean, funnily enough, you probably have a number of people around the table who may have evidence, because it's something that is very much an engagement by engagement perspective. I think the thinking we had when we were looking at the original proposal was that you don't want to wait until the very last minute to say, oh crumbs, I haven't got enough evidence to make the report. But I think, I mean, I can certainly think of instances where at the late stages we know that there has been additional work that's been done, but I'm also conscious that there are regulatory findings where maybe the suggestion is that perhaps the auditor could have done more at that particular closing stage. So I don't know whether anybody else around the table has any input, because it's probably the kind of things that that maybe the regulatory community see slightly more and have something to share. So Jim, I don't know whether anybody else has any views around the table there on Natasha's question.
Let me ask, anyone have any comments relative to Natasha's point, either virtually or here on the table? I don't see that, Sue, that we have anything additional.
May I just elaborate very, very briefly, because in a sense that evidence would help potentially inform the strength of the requirement. So, you know, if it's being used and it's being used effectively, then we know it's working. If it's not being used, then that tells you something also. So I think that sort of thing would actually be really quite helpful in informing this process, as well as the broader process that we've been talking about here, which is the streamlining, which I think is absolutely key. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Anyone else? Galen, response?
Yeah, I don't know if it's speaking directly. I have a difficult time hearing some of Sue's response, but I think in auditing, that's been my experience in most major audit areas, there's a requirement for a conclusion. And I'm not sure how a conclusion is any different from a stand back. So maybe that would be a consideration.
I'm thinking about that one. Interesting. Sue, I think some of us are having some challenges hearing you. So if you can speak a little louder, that might be helpful. Let's see. Yeah.
Apologies. Is that any better?
I think so.
I think we're nearly there, actually. I think we've done all the hard stuff.
I know you're almost there. You have one more question.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just move on to the final slides, please. So just highlighting the way forward. The task force will continue discussing the feedback and looking at the areas we haven't progressed yet, and progress on the drafting after the September discussion. On the current work plan, audit evidence is expected to be approved by the board in June 2024. But we do recognise that may change based on the future planning decisions that are taken by the board in the September meeting. My apologies, you're probably also hearing my house burglar alarm, which has just gone off. So any noise in the background, I apologise for that. So that I think is, obviously you discussed yesterday the feedback on the strategy and work plan, and I'm sure that will inform the next steps for audit evidence. So with that, Jim, I think Michelle, if you can just move on to the next slide. It's really just whether there's any other feedback from the CAG for the audit evidence task force to consider as we move forward.
Well, Sue, I applaud your efforts to remain calm as someone is burglarizing your house while you present, but you're doing a fantastic job. Paul.
Okay, I've had a chance to have a sit back test, and that is reflecting on the stand back. It does seem to me it's about professional skepticism primarily, and I think it's something that, throughout the audit, it should be done, practically all the time. So for me, the stand back tests, I have a little bit of difficulty with them because, as you say, Jim, they're popping up with increasing regularity. Anyway, that's a personal reflection on stand back. The other issue, interestingly, was, for me at least, was the one around illustrations and examples. Clearly with technology, we've got an area where you put any examples or illustrations in, and within 6 months, it looks about 20 years old. So coming back to Galen's point, I think examples and illustrations, especially in relation to technology, is really best avoided, especially if you're trying to drive at a principle-based overarching standard, which we have with audit evidence ISO 500. That then sort of begs the question, well, how do you cover off with examples and illustrations? And you can have a staff document, and again, you go through the process and you create a PDF and you put it up there, and the PDF perhaps oftentimes, practitioners and the rest will not immediately see the connection between the two documents, the authoritative standard and the guidance, which is meant to sort of help in its application. So then I'm thinking, well, is there any way you can tie the two together? And in an electronic standard, you could imagine that you could say, well, here's some examples and illustrations, and there's a click-through link, and perhaps the examples and illustrations, rather than taking you to a PDF document, could take you to a web page which could be more regularly updated. And I do think, so, we need to be thinking a little bit more out of the box, especially in this area of technology, and using technology to help solve some of these challenges. So in a nutshell, I'm just wondering whether the examples and illustrations, to maintain their currency and accessibility, that they could be hosted somewhere on the website of the IAASB, and you have a hyperlink taking you from the standard to those examples. Just a thought.
Thank you, Paul. It's an interesting concept, this stand back, but there's also been a proliferation of the word professional skepticism. It's like sprinkled in like salt in all the standards. And I think that also can have an unintended effect in that people become, or practitioners become, somewhat numb to the constant reminder to remain professionally skeptical. It seems like the stand back is more of an action versus a consideration. Maybe there's a third word we can, the board can come up with, something that's in between the two, something new. Okay, anyone? Hilda.
Thank you, and hi, Sue. I was relating to what Paul said on examples and illustrations. I think we started this by saying, there is a need for this. I think in practice there is a need for this, but that's not necessarily something that indeed you would want to see in a standard because it needs to be updated. But something somewhere else where it's useful and it is much easier to update it so that it is, following what the day of today is. That would be a good idea. So that's why I wanted to support this. Thank you.
Does outline the importance of implementation guidance or something like that. John?
Since we're on one of my favorite topics, audit evidence, might as well go ahead while we're looking for great ideas for all these difficult concepts. So one thought to offer, because these in practice are all very difficult to, Christian, get to that bigger picture and where in the standards and how exactly to get auditors to think a little bit more about this. But to the extent this is helpful, when thinking about the relevance and reliability of audit evidence, currently this significant threshold is there, and we think that might be a little too high when auditors are actually trying to think about the reliability and relevance of audit evidence. And so to try to help conceptualize a little better, we're thinking maybe the use of the degree to which the attributes are applicable in the circumstances, and the degree to which the auditor may depend on such information. So someone has to then really think about the specific context, could be a little more helpful than just significant. And so this degree to which we thought might be helpful to be able to apply some of these difficult concepts that we're discussing. So that was one thought I wanted to offer, since we're having such a great discussion about audit evidence and all of the difficulties. I do have another, if anyone is still interested. Sue, should I continue?
Please do.
All right, and this relates to the actual definition. We touched on it a little bit about, what actually is audit evidence, but we think it may be useful to consider introducing the concept of information that corroborates or contradicts assertions in the financial statements, again, as a way to help an auditor think a little bit more specifically about the actual audit evidence. And right in the standard at the appropriate time, especially the contradicts assertions in the financial statements. But to the extent those two ideas are useful, I wanted to at least offer those.
Thank you, Jean. I saw someone else's card up. Christian.
Jean, that triggered something in my mind, what you just said, the last point. Contradictory information, isn't that where you really need to stand back and look at the big picture to say, okay, this is the information obtained. This is information that is audit evidence. And then you have contradictory information. I think then you really need to stand back and say, okay, let's have a look how this fits into the picture. So I think, are you going down that road?
Yes, absolutely.
That makes sense.
So that gives you something to think about. I also see we have a comment from our POB member, Sandra.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we think that the issues discussed with the CAG are reflective of the comments raised in the comment letters. So I just wanted to add that. I think as an aside, sitting here, I think that one of the things when it comes to the technology task force, or I'm sorry, the technology discussion, is that one of the things that people outside of the audit profession, users, investors, the like, currently are experiencing as confusion is that we hear the auditors all promoting and talking about how they're going to have generative AI and they're really using technology and they're using it at the company. And then we have standard setters who are accounting standard setters who say, oh, we can't possibly provide that information because the companies just don't have the technology or data for it. And we're like, well, how can that be? Right? And so there's a real need from a communication to the end investor or user about what information sets are changing, what type of technology is being used, and more specifically, how it's being deployed, right? In a way in which they can understand its relevance to the financial or the non-financial information that they're getting, right? Because we're getting very mixed messages from, you know, we can't get better segment information because it's just not available. But the auditors are selling they're using generative AI. What do we do with that, right? I'm just using that as an example. So that's one. I think I need to go back and read the entirety of this in looking at relevance and reliability myself, because I think that investors have a very different view of relevance versus reliability. Auditors place a high degree of importance on reliability, and investors place a much higher degree of importance on relevance, right? We always like to joke that amortized cost is highly reliable and certainly irrelevant to investors because it is completely backward looking, right? So I need to go back and read this and consider, like, has an external perspective on some of this, particularly when it comes to evaluating external evidence and how it might change an investor, or it might be coming from an investor, right? So auditors may not think it's particularly relevant, but it is how the world is viewing the company under audit, right? So just by its very nature, it could be affecting price, particularly when you think of it in the context of short sellers, and a lot of their information is dismissed, and many times they are wrong, and many times they are wrong in the short run and right in the long run, right? So I think that is really sort of that. I have to go back and read that with all of that in the context, but I just would add that auditors and investors have very different notions of relevance and reliability of their importance. And I get it, why they do, but I would just say that when you do the stand back test, you have to say, who is it relevant to? I mean, audit evidence, I guess, always has to be good, but it also can inform you by simply being relevant. Yeah. No.
Thank you, Sandra. Kristen, your 10th up, okay.
Yes, thanks, Jim. And Sandra, I just want to reflect what you were saying, that it's in line with Jean's comment. I think the problem of taking short seller information into consideration, which is very often contradictory information compared to the audit evidence obtained. The problem is, you mentioned they might be right in the long run.
Yeah.
They might not be right in the short run. But with exactly that example, we're in the situation as an auditor to opine as of a certain day in the short run, which is the problem. At the end of the day, if something comes up, everybody's like, you have the information available. Why didn't you take that into consideration? But that's with hindsight. So I think there's a big issue with what you're trying to bring across. I understand that, but with respect to the auditor being in the situation to come up with an opinion or a conclusion at a certain day during the audit, I think that is something we also need to take into consideration if we discuss your aspect.
Right. I agree 100% with what you said. I'm just saying that my experience, having been an auditor and a controller, and now sitting on the other side, is I'm amazed at how many people doing the audit and people doing who are in the financial reporting, they don't even know who owns the company, right? And they don't know if they're active or they're passive or what the market's view is of the company, right? So I think it may be a tone from the top evaluation, and there are elements of their position and view that have insights with respect to their view about revenue recognition and whether that, or supplier finance, and where this, so I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm saying they may give you clues as to things you need to spend more time on. But you're right, with hindsight, it's always 2020, right?
Jim, last comment on that one. Auditing listed companies where you have a huge portfolio on short selling activities, you will always have a look at that if you're smart. However, there's always a risk of misusage of short sellers' information because they might have a interest. So the information might be not, as neutral as very often deemed to be, because there's a, purpose-driven information from their side as well.
Oh, completely. Because they take a position and then they talk about it, right? And so sometimes they're talking the stock down on purpose. I don't disagree with that, right? But you have to, I'm just saying, there are shades of information and truth in that, and it's best for auditors to just put it into their mindset and think about it. Yeah.
Thank you for the PIB perspective. Sue, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Well, that was oh, sorry. I can see Natasha's hand up.
I just saw that as well. Natasha,
Okay.
I may have missed you. Did you have a final comment?
I was just going to add to what Sandra was saying, but do we have time before I?
Yes.
Okay,
Go ahead.
I'll be brief. I was just going to, I think probably agree and also disagree, but as ever, investors are a diverse bunch. So I don't think it's unhelpful for you to hear different perspectives. I think Sandra's right in terms of the need to just be aware, I suppose, of what investors are thinking. But I would be very concerned if we de-emphasize reliability, because I do think reliability is absolutely critical here as well as relevance. And I guess my starting point is very much that the audit is there to ensure that those accounts are providing that true and fair view, and that ultimately is looking at a point of time naturally, but inevitably we look forward to look back. In other words, we need to be cognizant of those probable losses, liabilities, etc., that are in the pipeline right now that could affect asset values, etc., and be prudent in that regard. But I'm not looking for those accounts or the auditors to help me with pricing that company. That's up to the market, really, and for investors to do much more in a forward-looking way, as Sandra said. And I think it's really important to retain that distinction in terms of purpose. So just a call from me. I think that please don't de-emphasize reliability. I think it's absolutely critical. Not to suggest that Sandra was suggesting that. I think relevance too, but yeah, different perspective on that. Thank you.
Thank you for your perspective. Okay, Sue, I think I can finally go back to you for a wrap up.
Thank you. Well, then that was a really interesting discussion, actually, and I very much appreciated the opportunity to hear those perspectives and the feedback, and it definitely gives us some kind of bigger picture things to think about. Just by way of closing off this part of the discussion, I did just want to come back on a couple of things that Jean said, because I think a couple of times you've referenced how hard this project is, and I 100% agree. And just to say that your suggestions around the corroborating contradictory information we already have on our list to build into some of the application material. But you also suggested about using the terminology, the degree to which, and I just wanted to say that that is something that we've gone through several times before. The challenge we have with that is that all the attributes are probably relevant to some degree, and so that sliding scale is probably a little bit tricky. But it's I mean, clearly it's a suggestion that we will keep coming back to and working on. So, but thank you very much for the suggestions there. It's really helpful. So I think in summary, Jim, very much appreciate the feedback we've had here. We've had a steer in terms of a couple of the a couple of the questions, some probably consistent with what I would expect from the feedback letters that you provided, and helpful discussion around the kind of stand back piece. So I think we will be speaking to you or the next stage of this group as the project progresses. So thank you very much for the input.
Sue, we very much appreciate your time and efforts. And I think we had some good discussion, as you mentioned, and something to think about as you move forward. So thank you so much. For the CAG, we have a break because our last speaker is a very hard stopping point. I'm going to change the break time, and we're going to come back at 10:10 Eastern time. So 10:10 Eastern time, and enjoy your break. We're going to give a 1-minute warning.
Jim, I'm just testing my audio. Can you hear me?
Hi, Julie. I can hear you perfectly well.
Okay, great. Thanks.
All right, I think we will reconvene, and this will be our last session for today. It's going to be fraud in the financial statements. One, I think, important aspect for the CAG to note is the IAASB intends to approve the exposure draft in their December meeting. So the implication here is this is really our last chance to provide any thoughts or comments on the current draft. So keep that in mind. And Julie, thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. That I don't know if that's ominous or or a good thing the way you just laid that out, but we're certainly here to have the discussion. I am going to run through some of the slides, but I'm also going to assume that you've had a chance to read through this in advance, and therefore we'll just maybe pick up some of the highlights as we go. Looking forward to the discussion piece. As Jim mentioned, we're at a pretty critical point in the project right now. We are going to present these proposals next week at the board meeting, but with the intention that in December we will have an exposure draft for approval. So as you can imagine, we're looking forward to that exposure draft and hearing what you have to say. And in fact, if you think back to the March CAG meeting, you had a little sneak peek at some of these proposals because we hadn't come to the board in March. And so hopefully this will jog your memory a little bit about what we talked about in March, and we have a few updates to provide today. So with that, I'm just going to go to the next slide. This slide we put together just to explain how we approached the proposed changes to ISO 240. Of course, we considered the standard setting characteristics that are in the public interest framework. We had a very detailed, very detailed actually fraud project proposal. So that's a blessing and a curse at the same time, but it has been a great roadmap in ensuring that we are dealing with all of the proposed actions in that proposal. So the task force has stayed true to the items in that project proposal. ISO 240 is a bit of a unique standard in that it builds on a number of other standards. So you'll see there's some standards listed there. And in fact, we have in the introduction piece of the proposals, the standards that 240 builds on, but you can see it builds on some foundational standards like 200, 220, 315, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Of course, 330, and in the transparency section, we have proposals that build on ISO 701. So it's a bit unique in that it has some very specific requirements that are just in 240, but it also builds and puts the fraud lens on a number of other standards. And then, of course, we have our CUSP drafting principles, and we've had a review of our proposals by the CUSP expert, let's call them. I'm calling them that. In advance so that we're prepared and have that done and ready to go when we get to exposure draft stage. The next slide is really a slide that we're using consistently through a number of our presentations, our issues papers. The task force goes back to this all the time. And in fact, the heading on this slide, I believe, came from some of the discussions we had in March at the CAG meeting, which was how do we demonstrate with the changes we're proposing that we're promoting consistent practice and changing auditor behavior? I think the CAG challenged us back then to say, what what changes are you making that's going to change auditor behavior? And so we developed this slide as sort of our North Star. This is the slide we go back to all the time. You can see that professional skepticism, of course, goes across all of the different aspects, and it's sort of an overarching principle. Of course, audit documentation has to be there as well to demonstrate that the auditor is not only complied with the requirements, but has a sufficient level of documentation for let's say an experienced auditor to understand what was done. We have to have that across the bottom, but we also have the different aspects that I'm going to run through in the following slides, which are what we say are key changes. Of course, this is not all of the changes that we've made, but definitely they fit into, largely fit into these buckets. So we've spent time on clarifying the auditor's responsibilities, certainly ongoing communications through the audit with not only management, those charged with governance and others as well about fraud-related matters. Some of that was in Extent 240, but we've highlighted it in a number of places and made it more prominent. I mentioned the fraud lens before, but certainly in the risk identification and assessment piece, there's quite a bit of work been done there. A new section about fraud and suspected fraud, which we'll get to, and then of course transparency, which was one of the topics we kind of dealt with at the beginning. So you're probably quite familiar with that topic, but it was one we tackled a little bit earlier, but definitely one that comes into play as the output of all the work the auditor's done with respect to fraud. So with that, I'm just going to jump into the rest of the slides. Like I said, I'm going to highlight some of the key items in these slides, but we can certainly take any questions that you have as we go through, or actually when we pause for the questions, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. So on professional skepticism, I mentioned it's sort of an overarching concept. It's important in every audit, and it's important for the auditor to consider it all times, but certainly when you're thinking about fraud and putting the fraud lens on things, professional skepticism is important. And so we have had some proposals in the standard around remaining professionally skeptical throughout the audit. Having that actually upfront saying the auditor needs to remain alert and be professionally skeptical throughout the audit. Authenticity, interesting one. I think you've just heard from the audit evidence task force chair about audit evidence. Authenticity does have a crossover with audit evidence, but it's an area where we felt from a fraud perspective we wanted to touch on, because that could be an area where if someone wanted to alter or alter the authenticity of a document, that could be an area we wanted to spend some time. So we've included some material with respect to that. And I'm remiss to mention the fact that we've collaborated with a number of the other task forces, that being the audit evidence task force to the extent that they're along in their project. Professional skepticism also has a consultation group, and we've consulted with them on a number of these topics as well. And then we have remaining alert throughout the audit, and in a couple of other standards as well, we've built in this concept of making sure we're not biased towards obtaining corroborative or contradictory evidence one way or the other. And so we built that into the proposals as well. Next slide, please. Auditors' responsibilities. Rest assured, we have not fundamentally changed the auditor's responsibilities, but what we did and what we outlined in our project proposal, which was an important piece for us, was ensuring that we were clear about and emphasize what the auditor's responsibilities were and what the auditor can do about dealing with fraud in the context of an audit of financial statements. So what we did is sort of decoupled the responsibilities from the inherent limitation wording that was there before. We certainly have not removed the inherent limitation wording because it's inherent. We can't do that in a standard. We can't just magically make the inherent limitations disappear. But what we've done is we've been assured upfront that we're clear about what the auditor's responsibilities are and what the auditor can do. And then we've, kept some of the other extant wording there, but made sure that it's upfront and clear what the auditor's responsibilities are. The other interesting piece was ensuring that there was a tie back to the auditor's responsibilities around non-compliance with laws and regulations. So if you've taken a look through our proposed draft, you'll see in a couple of places we've made that connection back to ISO 250, which was also part of our project proposal to ensure that it was clear that relationship between 240 and 250. Ongoing communication, so next slide. Mentioned this as one of our key principles. Some of these requirements in the orange boxes on your slide are there today in extant 240, but there are some new ones that we've introduced in our proposals. One is at the top left there in the slide, and that is just a upfront overarching requirement that throughout the audit, you are engaging with and communicating with management and those charged with governance. That was an important add that we made. While some might say, well, was there inherently in some of the other requirements. If you literally work through the standard, it was a little further down. We thought this was really important to have earlier in the standard to ensure that these communications need to happen throughout the audit. So it's not just I've completed the audit, now I'm going to go talk with the audit committee or those charged with governance or management about things. You're doing this at the appropriate times throughout the audit. So we do have a new requirement up front on that point. Another new one was in the dedicated section now around fraud or suspected fraud, we have a requirement that you're making inquiries with management, because if you've identified a fraud or suspected fraud, then that should be, the first place you go. You need to go talk to management. They need to investigate. They need to have a process for investigation. And so those communications are really important. And in that section, we have a new requirement about ensuring those inquiries are happening. Also, a signposting, we mentioned there a signposting of required communications and potentially reporting to an appropriate authority outside the entity. That is a new requirement, probably self-explanatory, but if fraud or suspected fraud is identified, the auditor needs to consider what communications need to happen in that respect. And then we have some enhanced, just in the blue box there, some enhanced combination of what's already there and maybe some additional enhancements on communications throughout the standard where it makes sense around fraud-related matters. So you're familiar with things when you're performing risk assessment and other activities where you're making inquiries. The other ones I'm not going to talk a whole lot about. They're carry forward extant requirements, and we've just sort of carried them forward and put them in the appropriate place in their proposals. Next slide, please. I mentioned the fraud lens. This slide is specific about the fraud lens on risk identification and assessment, but I will just say the fraud lens that we've applied in our proposals is beyond just, the 315 risk identification and assessment fraud lens. I mentioned some of the other standards where we've included requirements that put the fraud lens on standards like ISO 220, 701, 330 as an example. But one of the key items in our project proposal was ensuring that ISO 240, the proposals mirrored sort of the flow and the requirements in ISO 315, because one of the key items in 240 is this risk identification and assessment around fraud. So we have applied the fraud lens exclusively, and if you've looked in the draft, you can see it follows the flow exactly of 315, and it's really pulling out those fraud-related matters as it pertains to risk identification and assessment. So that's really what's in the left side of the slide there. The middle box is just explaining what the different aspects of that is. So we've covered the different aspects that are in 315. And I think this might have come up in our March CAG discussion as well around fraud risk factors. We do have an appendix that is specific to fraud risk factors. And in one or two, I'm going to get this wrong, at least one or two of the requirements, we refer explicitly to the fraud risk factors and ensure that, in that whole risk assessment identification and assessment process, the auditor is taking into account the fraud risk factors. So we pulled that in there because we thought that was very important, that it's there. And as I mentioned, there is an appendix that goes through a number of those. And just speaking about the appendix briefly, a number of them needed a little bit of an update, potentially a modernization. And so while not a wholesale change to any of that content, we have updated a number of the areas in the appendices to ensure that they're a little more current to what's happening today. On the next slide, fraud or suspected fraud is identified. This was a topic we talked to the CAG about in March because we were going to showcase this new section in our meeting in June with the board, but we still have a section dedicated to this topic, and it is really three-pronged. It's the first prong there is when fraud or suspected fraud is identified, the partner does a number of things. The first one being obtaining an understanding. That's really important and ensuring what the effect might be on the audit engagement. I mentioned the communications with management and those charged with governance before. So this is another place where it comes in. And then again, the if needed or if required, reporting to an appropriate authority. That's sort of the starting point. The engagement partner needs to pause and actually obtain an understanding of what's happening to determine what the next steps would be. We did link a requirement to 315 and 330 here because we believe that the auditor would need to, because an audit is iterative and this might be new information you didn't have when you're performing your risk assessment, it could be quite possible the auditor needs to perform additional risk identification procedures. They may need to change their risk, they might not, but they need to at least consider the fact that that would be a step they take. And then potentially the outcome of whatever that risk assessment change or not would be, there would be a response needed, a response that would come out of ISA 330. So that's the sort of middle category there. And then the final column on this slide are the actual additional audit procedures that the auditor needs to perform. So there's a number of inquiries. We thought it was key that the auditor is evaluating the entity's process to investigate. So we've used that term in a number of different places. Control deficiencies might be apparent as a result of that identified fraud or suspected fraud. So the auditor needs to determine if that's the case. There could be additional responsibilities, and if there are other engagements, if applicable, we would need to consider that as an auditor as well. So that is a required set of procedures that would apply whenever you have an identified fraud or suspected fraud. There's no threshold to that. That applies every time you're in this category of identified fraud or suspected fraud. Next slide. I think I've covered some of these. This is more of the follow through. So you've done what I've just described on the previous slide. We talked about the required responses, but then you've got to determine whether you have a misstatement, follow through whether that misstatement is material. And then there are required responses, of course, if that financial statements are materially misstated as a result of that analysis. And then there could be there would be circumstances potentially where you're unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, and that would be one of the outcomes. And therefore, there are requirements in the standard as to what the auditor needs to do in that case. We do recognize that identified fraud or suspected fraud is likely on a spectrum. So there could be cases where the investigation and the analysis is rather quick and fairly simple, and you can ring fence the issue as a result of performing some of the procedures I walked through on the previous slide. But we also know that there are sometimes really large, complex frauds or complex issues for the auditor to address. And you could be in the circumstance where you're just not able to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And of course, we needed to have that possibility outlined in the standard as to what the auditor needs to do. We tried to address the spectrum, giving some examples in the application material because we thought that was really important, because Even in some of my experiences in the past, I've kind of come across both sides of the spectrum. And of course, the auditor needs to respond in both cases, but the auditor's response in one case versus another could be quite different, and the extent of it could be quite different. On the next slide, we summarize our transparency. I won't spend a lot of time here because we had a pretty robust discussion about this before. We've proceeded with the board's direction some time back. I'm losing track of my memory as to when the board gave us this direction. It was probably even in 2022, Jasper, if I have this right. Quite some time ago, the board directed us to proceed with this use of the CAM mechanism for transparency related to fraud in the auditor's report. So we are still proceeding with that. We have added some requirements that build on 701. So this is not a separate process. This is a build, in applying 701 concept. So it's not a parallel or a second filter that's happening, but we have given the auditor considerations that they need to take into account when they're thinking about fraud related or key audit matters related to fraud as it goes. There's also in the auditor's report itself, some signposting as to what those matters might be. So if you have key audit matters related to fraud, you need to identify in the, in the subheading in the title that key audit matter is related to fraud. And we do have a requirement in our proposals that if there are no key audit matters related to fraud, the auditor needs to state that. It's quite similar to the requirement in 701 related to key audit matters more generally, where the auditor would need to state there's no key audit matter. So we have added this additional requirement that if you have no key audit matters related to fraud, you need to state that. Sorry, just take a sip of water. And then finally on documentation, we've added a couple of new documentation requirements. I would say largely a number of the requirements look and feel like what's in extant, but maybe a little bit more enhanced. On the slide, you can see we've underlined some of the changes to the enhanced requirements. And I would say in a couple of those cases, it's more about ensuring that in the documentation itself, there's some documentation around the auditor's thought, I'll call it the auditor's thought process. So the rationale for the significant judgments, we've added that in a couple of those cases there, you can see. What did the auditor think about? What were the professional judgments, significant professional judgments made, and getting to the conclusion. So while those requirements probably look and feel similar to what's there today, we have added some flavor to that to ensure that in the audit documentation, there is an obvious link to things that the auditor considered and how they got to their conclusions. There are a couple new documentation requirements, and for the most part, those link up to new requirements that we've included in our proposals. So the first one there being the fact that we've added this new section in ISA 240 proposed, where we have this link to the risk identification and assessment. Of course, if you're requiring that robust risk identification and assessment, we need to have the documentation, the outcome of that. So that's the top left green box. And then the bottom left green box is the documentation around that section I just talked about around fraud or suspected fraud. So if you're in that situation, there are some documentation requirements to ensure that that is well documented and evidenced in the file. So, Jim, that was a whirlwind tour through our proposals. I hope that wasn't too quick, but I really wanted to ensure we had enough time with this group to get their feedback and ensuring that, we can have that robust discussion. We'll take the feedback. Like I said, we are having a session Monday with the board to go through this again as another full read. And so we are keen to hear from the CAG what their thoughts are. So our first question covers 4 areas. So I'm happy to take it all at once, Jim, if that makes sense. It's really 4 of the key principles from that slide, the emphasis on the auditor's responsibilities, that fraud lens I talked about around risk identification and assessment, the fraud or suspected fraud work effort requirements, and the transparency.
Thank you, Julie. That's a lot to consider. It's helpful in the presentation where you highlight what's new, what's enhanced. I think that will help the CAG. So let me see if we have a reaction here in terms of the information provided. And we'll open it up to CAG members. John, you're going to be first out the gate.
You know, I'm a little reluctant after the last discussion, but here I am.
No, it's good to have the discussion. Challenge us.
This one's much simpler, but very difficult project. Thank you, Julie, for the presentation. The only thought I had related to applying the fraud lens on the risk identification and assessment is to think about whether the emphasis to continue all the way through the issuance of the audit report is there. Certainly the iterative, and we can see that emphasis to go throughout the process, but to be sure to emphasize that risk assessment all the way through the issuance of the audit report was the one thought we had.
Thank you, Sean. Natasha.
Great, thank you, and thank you so much, Julie. Really, really important work. I had, I think, a couple of comments on your question topics. First of all, on the responsibilities, I think it was slide 5. I was slightly surprised not to see shareholders, investors as categories of who's the auditor is responsible to. So interested in that, or indeed even the public interest as a responsibility. With regards to management and TCWG, those charged with governance, I did want, those are bucketed together throughout, and yet clearly from a governance perspective, they're very, very distinct in that, those charged with governance, such as the audit committee, is very much answerable to shareholders. We vote on them, and we would expect them to represent our interest in overseeing the management. So I wanted to understand that, because it seems to me that where you're going to management with a potential fraud concern, there is a risk there of tipping off. And it might be appropriate in certain circumstances that the auditor would go first to the audit committee that is hopefully mostly independent or entirely independent before going to management, because of precisely that risk. You're sort of potentially going to those who know about it, who then, so that seems to me just an obvious one. On the transparency, really great to see the key audit matter enhancements. Sorry, yeah, the question I had on that was, you talk about them having to assess the risks of material misstatements. That in that assessment, clearly fraud is one of those things where you have the fraud itself, which may have a rather limited impact in terms of, the financial in the first instance, but it's then the ramifications of the fraud that could lead to a much bigger impact for the business, that could lead, of course, to insolvency, depending on how that ripple effect goes. So, risks of regulatory action, risks of litigation, and of course, reputational consequences. What would that mean? Does that mean that the customers then move away from them, et cetera, et cetera? So, are those explicitly things that the auditor would need to consider in assessing that materiality? Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Wei?
Oh, thanks, James. Thanks for the update. I appreciate work has been done. I'm supportive of the task force's position on clarifying and emphasizing the auditor's responsibilities regarding fraud in an audit of financial statements. In my view, this revision represents that PAs should assume the auditing responsibility for fraud in an audit of financial statements affirmatively. I wish the task force a successful September meeting. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei, for your support. Klaus?
Yes, good afternoon or still good morning in New York. And thank you, Julie, for the presentation. I think you have made considerable progress in this very, very important project. Overall, I'm very positive to the developments. I think I have maybe 3 reflections. It's not criticism or questions, but yeah, there may be a question. The first one is that it's regarding communication on CAMs, because now, as I now read it, the proposal is here also to say that if there is no CAMs related for the communicator, also includes a statement to this effect. My question is, have you reflected on, if you make such a statement, there are nothing to reflect on how that might impact the liability of auditors? Because I think it's always, I would always be cautious to state something that there's nothing to report, going back to, okay, you have to prove that you have done anything according to the process, according to the standards, but that it's a question, so to say, if you have reflected on that liability to state there is nothing. It's one thing to say that we have detected fraud. It's the second question I have is also regarding the scalability of the proposals, because to me, as a non-auditor coming from the business side, it seems like this is very much drafted for large companies, and this is the kind of environment you have written it. So that would also be interesting to see, because if you take a process to say go into very small companies, say that those charged with governance are still the owners, and also this is still the management. So this may probably wraps up the whole process, because the one you're detecting it or suspecting is doing the fraud is the owner slash manager of the company. And the third reflection is more of externalities, is that have you reflected on how this might also impact the behavior of the audit client and also the reporting of the client? Because I would assume that if you tighten up the processes, like from the auditor side, and also you be more specific regarding CAMs, for example, I would expect that that also puts some pressure on the company, so to say, to write something either in the financial statements or in the director's report or wherever it would be. It might have an effect also on those reporting requirements. So it's just an open question, see if this you have something you have reflected on. So I stop there.
Thank you, Klaus. Mike Fritz.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for the presentation. I, like Klaus, I'm struggling a little bit with page 10, where it talks about, as he mentioned, the key audit matter for fraud, where maybe you do procedures, it ends up not being a material item, and you didn't spend a significant amount of time. And perhaps it's highlighted by the asterisk where it says it's expected that matters relating to fraud communicated will require significant auditor attention. And maybe that's the out of, you don't have to do it, but I'm struggling where, if, let's say I get a whistleblower complaint and it says there's something I need to investigate, I get some people involved, but it isn't then a significant matter. I'm struggling with, I've still got to put that in the key audit matter section, but I may just be reading that incorrectly.
Thank you, Mike. Anyone else with a perspective? Hilda?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Julie. I think overall, this seems to go in the right direction. When you talk about fraud, there is no silver bullet that an auditor steps in and they can prevent fraud from happening, or they can detect all fraud. So I think the approach that has been taken to the standard is from a perspective that sounds reasonable as to what you could, as an auditor, achieve in this area. So overall, I'm afraid I have not gone through the detailed write-up of the standard until now. So I think that's expressing overall support for where you're at. I think we can relate to the comment that Natasha made on the tipping off. And I think I can also relate to some of the comments related to the CAM and what Klaas said, and maybe from his perspective, but also the other perspective. If normally for a CAM, you refer to something that is in the annual report by management. If there would be an expectation by the auditor, something needs to be there, but it's not there, then what does that mean for this CAM, and how do you deal with this? So I think the reporting of this CAM and always having one, I think we have not quite fully worked through what that would all mean in practice. And one I would say minor comment, in somewhere there are references to in the project you have not talked about this, in looking, for instance, at all journal entries as a step that you take to see if there would be any indications of fraud. And I think every end of the month, when a large company, they close their books, there might be a lot of journal entries to look at. And so we were wondering, is there a concept of materiality here that should be there? Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Any other comments from the CAG? Well, Julie, those are actually quite a few comments to consider. Do we have oh, okay, Jean,
I just wanted to add one more thought, building on what Hilda just brought up about the use of the word all. We thought about bringing it up in March, but since she's opened the door, I thought I would build on that a little bit. We were thinking it may be important, given the use of the word all, if all is going to continue, to think about whether something may be needed in the application material. And we're thinking of group audit contexts where, as Hilda just brought up, perhaps there's a component that's scoped out because it doesn't present any risk of material misstatements. So the use of the word all related to the journal entries could be a bit problematic for many to actually interpret what needs to happen. So that was all I wanted to raise.
Thank you, Jean. And I would also add, from my perspective, maybe looking at the CAMs again to think about what the outcomes may be if you follow through as suggested. Okay, Julie, I think we're ready for your thoughts.
Okay, I will tackle these. And of course, I probably neglected to mention that the fraud staff team is also joining me on this call. And if they want to add anything when I'm done, Jasper, Angelo, Henkin, feel free. So I think the first point was around ensuring that we emphasize that risk assessment continues throughout the engagement. Of course, we have ISO 315 that would state that you need to continue to do that, and that risk assessment's iterative, and there might be new information you need to circle back, but we'll take that back because we want to ensure. And that was one of the reasons why we added that bit in the fraud or suspected fraud category, to ensure that it was triggering the auditor to say, oh, I might need to go back and think about my risk assessment again. I've got new information. It may or may not, you may not revise your risk assessment, but you need to actually consider it. So it's a good point, but we were ensuring we were tackling that and ensuring it didn't get forgotten in the course of the standard. Talked a little bit about some of the communications, whether they're with management, whether they're with those charged with governance. We have, of course, we recognize that we're setting standards for audits of all different sizes, and that governance structure could be quite different, particularly in the area of fraud or suspected fraud, we have ensured that those communications are, you're not communicating directly first off the bat to someone who's involved in that fraud related matter. Of course, but there has to be, I think, some principles there and some judgment that the auditor takes in who they communicate. But we did want to ensure that that robust discussion with the governance of the entity was happening. And so that's why we had that as one of our key principles and as one of the items that we're focusing in on, that those robust discussions are happening, because they do play that role. Qualitative factors, I think, Natasha, you mentioned around, well, a fraud or suspected fraud on the surface might appear quite immaterial or sort of ring fence, but when you dig into it, there's other factors to consider. I think in the sense that we've tried to build in some qualitative factors throughout this standard. We know that fraud isn't always quantitatively material on its surface, and that there's quite often qualitative factors that you need to consider. We have built that in, and those would be things that the auditor would also need to consider when they're dealing with fraud. A couple of comments, Jim, I heard on the no CAM. We did, so a couple thoughts on that. So the statement that we make where we say there are no CAMs related to fraud is a similar requirement to what we had in ISO 701 with the CAMs, like that's been in existence for a number of years now. So that was no different, and we felt that that was an important, because we were bringing in this mechanism to report on matters related to fraud in the auditor's report. We felt that it was important that the auditor makes that statement in the auditor's report. Otherwise, there may be no mention of it whatsoever in the auditor's report. So we thought that was really important, and that it would make the auditor pause and ensure that they'd really thought through whether they had a key audit matter related to fraud. The other thing to keep in mind is that these matters start with a population of matters that are discussed with those charged with governance. So that's someone, it might be Josephine, calls it the hopper. That's the hopper. So that's your first step. So these matters have to rise to the level of the matters you're discussing with those charged with governance. And then you work through the similar filtering process that you do under 701 to ensure that you've pulled out those matters that are significant. Of course, if you get to the place where, as you work through that, there are no key audit matters related to fraud to report, then that's where you fall into the requirement around stating that in your report. But we do feel that with the robust requirements we've added, related to risk assessment, related to the more robust inquiries you're making, related to the fact that if you have a fraud or suspected fraud, you have more robust procedures to perform, sort of the focus on the areas that the auditor needs to consider with respect to fraud, that we would hope that more items make their way at least into those discussions with those charged with governance, and therefore would be candidates for key audit matters. Of course, we all know in the standard, there are at least the presumed risks, so the auditor needs to consider those. And we've also had some factors put into the standard where it should trigger the auditor to think about other matters that might have come to their attention in the course of their audit. So things like, if they had a significant deficiency related to a control that was to prevent or detect fraud, I would hope the auditor thinks about that in considering whether that might be a matter they talk about in CAMS. Can't speak specifically about what the behavior might be from an audit client perspective, but this is really about changing auditor behavior, and we would hope that others in the ecosystem, those being the client and the entities that the auditors are auditing, would take notice of the more robust requirements. And of course, I think this was the case when we implemented 701 initially, was, there were many more discussions with those charged with governance and management around the auditor report, around the CAMs, around what would make their way into the CAMs, why, maybe the auditor's reasoning. So my hope, of course, I can't control it, but my hope would be that would be something that would engage those charged with governance and have more conversations about what's there. just like CAMS, there would be a reference to something in the financial statements typically, but that's not required in all cases. And so it could be the case where a CAM is describing something that doesn't explicitly reference something in the financial statements. However, that might encourage management to disclose something that therefore would link back to the key audit matter. Scalability is also always a question that comes up. I think almost in every standard, we believe that what we have there is inherently scalable. We tried to keep it principles based. Of course, when you are in a scenario where you have fraud or suspected fraud, we wanted to ensure that the auditor was focusing on what they need to do. And so that's why we have the required procedures. I did mention what I call the spectrum, which is something might be quite simple and you work through those procedures very quickly. You ring fence it, you understand it, you document what you need and you move on. Others take quite a bit of time. That might even involve stopping work for a while. That might involve what someone's described as pencils down for a while because you need to actually pause. Management needs to investigate. You need to then understand what that is. But there's a spectrum there. And I think that's how we've tried to build the scalability into some of the requirements. We also, I mentioned some of the collaboration with the other task forces. Of course, we do collaborate with the small, medium-sized practice group. Probably have that name wrong, but the advisory group. And we have an LCE task force, which we will discuss with them as well. But we do try to build in, even without that, we do try to build in scalability in the principles that we're setting. I think last point on journal entries, everyone's favorite. I didn't mention it in the presentation because we covered it in March and it doesn't stick out as one of the key principles in our slide, but it's definitely an area we've spent some time on. And I think the comment was more about the use of the word all, and that comes into effect when we're talking about the requirement to determine the completeness of the journal entry population. So we've had a lot of discussions at the task force about this. We felt it was important to add that into the requirement because you need to ensure you have a complete population for which to perform your journal entry testing on. And without that starting point, we felt that it was like you're almost starting from a point of your test wasn't going to be robust enough because you're starting from a point where you haven't determined that completeness. So understand that in really complex audits, determining the all might be more complex, but we have had some discussions with some of our technology experts. We've had some discussions with those on the task force that practice in this area and have done this, and we feel that that is an appropriate step to have in the standard to determine that you have that complete population. Doesn't mean that every entry in that population will ultimately be part of your test, because once you work through your what I call profiling and your steps to choose your tests, they may or may not be part of that, but determining your completeness in the first place was important. It's also a good tie to some of the work that's been done on the exposure draft for ISO 500, because one of the key items there was the attributes of completeness and accuracy. And so we drew on the fact that that was deemed to be a really important concept in ED 500. And this is a substantive test, and we wanted to ensure that we built in the completeness requirement in our standard as well. So there's that tie back. Jim, that was, I felt like I talked a lot. I think I covered most of the comments.
Thank you, Julia. There were a lot of comments to cover, so I appreciate that. I do see a hand. Natasha, is your hand up anew?
Yeah, it is. Sorry, I just wanted to come back just to sort of clarify, the concern that I have here with regards to who the auditor speaks to. I think it's really, really important to make clear that management and those charged with governance are not always the same, certainly at least in listed companies where investors are more concerned. So I think it's really important, therefore, within the standard to make clear that where you're at the point of suspected or actual fraud, that you're going to those charged with governance, not management. I think that that's really critical. And then those charged with governance can then instruct as to what then happens. But I think this, from a governance perspective, eliding the two is quite dangerous. So really important to be clear within the text what the requirement is, and maybe you are, and I just wanted to make that point clearly. The second thing on the materiality, I wasn't suggesting that the fraud has quantitative and qualitative impacts, and the qualitative also need to be considered. I was saying fraud has narrow quantitative and then broader quantitative. In other words, financial. So the secondary impacts of fraud could be very financially material, but come from what follows: regulation, litigation, reputational loss. So those are very hard financial impacts, and just to make sure that those are being encompassed in auditors' consideration when they're thinking about those disclosures. Thank you.
One comment, Natasha, for those charged with governance, if you look at the companies that are, or the organizations that are audited, many do not have investors. So, for example, in the public sector, it's very rare that you would have an audit committee or a board of directors. So a lot of the language or the history behind those charged with governance is used to incorporate all those organizations in public sector and other that don't have, they may have stakeholders, but they don't necessarily have investor stakeholders. So that's how the term came about to some degree. But Julie, thoughts?
Probably nothing more, Jim, than what's been discussed. We'll certainly take all this feedback away and consider it. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I have more to add. I'd probably just be rambling at this point, but appreciate the feedback and we'll take it away. We have tried to build in the fact that certainly if you're in the fraud or suspected fraud place, you wouldn't go and talk to management who is involved, and it would be at least one level above that, and those sorts of governance particularly. So I think we've covered it there, but we'll definitely take the feedback, Jim, and make sure we've considered it.
All right, I don't see anything else. Julie, I'll turn it back to you.
I think we have one more slide, and it's probably our
yes.
the slide you've seen before, Jim. It's the other matters slide. We're certainly, I know we touched on those specific questions in question 1, or specific areas in question 1, but for sure, and considering the stage of this project, if there are other matters that the CAG members wanted to provide their feedback on, we're here to hear it.
And there also may be a way forward slide, I think
There is.
Is a final one. Any additional CAG perspectives here? Okay, Julie, I guess I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Way forward. So mentioned the board meeting, that is on Monday, and we are going to again work through a full read of the draft. Of course, we got a substantial number of comments from the June board meeting, and the task force has considered all of those and made revisions. Some revisions, some not, but we definitely contemplated all the comments we heard in June. And so that is on our agenda for next week. Throughout October to December, we will reflect on whatever feedback we hear next week from the board. We'll meet as a task force to continue to advance the draft. I would say it's at a pretty good stage right now. So we're looking for, that final board feedback to be able to get that ready for December, which is when we will expect an approval of the exposure draft by the board. We have collaborated, as I mentioned, with a number of the other task forces. We've had a cusp review done of the standard already. So that's already been done and ticked off the to-do list. I hadn't mentioned IAASB earlier, but we have collaborated and ensured that we are connecting with them. We've connected with them a couple of times already. One in advance of the June meeting to show them some proposed drafting that we had we had included in our proposals. Of course, we got some feedback on that at the June meeting. So some of that drafting has been revised, and we've gone back to IAASB with what's changed. So we are committed to them to continue to ensure that they are kept up to date where we are. But I would say pending any real changes from September, we don't have more to share with them in getting ready for our exposure draft. But that said, it's an open item for us until such time as we are approved on our exposure draft. So we continue to do that. I'm meeting with the team in a couple of days to continue to plan our outreach. Some of that has happened already, and some of that will happen in the fourth quarter and potentially post exposure draft. So I think that's it on the way forward.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for your time for their presentation, and we wish you well in your presentation to the board meeting next week. All right, well, this
Thanks, Jim.
concludes the fraud section. In terms of where we are right now, I'm going to turn to Sandra to see if you have any PIOB perspectives for the week that you'd like to share.
I think that this morning we had a PIOB call at 4 a.m. So I'm a little like, oh, already. I think that that broadly speaking, where some of these sort of thoughts came up, I think that broadly speaking, I think that the sustainability discussion, both at the IAASB and here, raises a whole series of really interesting issues. We talked about, it's a constrained optimization. There's, a lot to do, but a lot has been done. I think that the notion of, as this gets finalized and adopted, that there may need to be just a monitoring of the implementation issues before sort of waiting for a post-implementation review per se. There's going to be a lot of issues that I think that, come up as people adopt it. I think that, one of the observations I made at the IAASB is that the whole notion of sustainability raises also a focus on the financial reporting, when you start to compare and contrast the two items and say, oh, well, what does this mean in financial reporting, and what does it mean in the context of sustainability? Even in the conversation about what the public interest issues are, right? If you look at the public interest framework, it talks about capital market participants as opposed to all stakeholders. So like when you think of ISA 5000 and being framework agnostic, the public interest issues are framework dependent, right? So there's sort of, one thing we need to talk about is how do you weigh those things? I think also one of the things that occurs to me is there is this important need for users to understand that there's a level playing field between professional accountants and non-professional accountants. How will that be communicated? And I think the regulators have a role to play in that. I think that's something that needs to be sort of emphasized by the PIOB to the monitoring group and the like, in the sense of that we can create a standard, but they help to facilitate in creating the level playing field. Those are just things off the top of my head. Certainly there's projects in different phases and moving along. I think on the fraud one, I didn't weigh in, but I think, we don't have any new issues. It'll be interesting to see the comments when it's exposed, and particularly the discussion about the CAM and the reporting of it. I think that will be an issue of particular interest. Those are just sort of not just even some standard specific, but sort of when I step back and I consider the conversation for the IAASB versus here, and just things that cut across all of them from a public interest perspective. I'm sure I'll think of a couple other when I walk out of the room, but those are just sort of my overarching perspectives. A lot of good work has been done on the sustainability stuff. There's a lot that has been to consider. There's still a lot to be done, and there will be, you know, this is a huge education process for everyone. Investors, the people doing the reporting, the people doing the assurance, and, you know, me personally, my own personal perspective is I'm really interested to see what this all looks like in 2025 and where we go from here, not just for assurance, but for investors. Does it meet their expectations of what they think it's going to be? Does the reporting meet their expectations? Does the audit meet their expectations? I think that'll present some really interesting conversations, I think, in 2025.
Thank you, Sandra. And I think you probably had a unique perspective this week because you were able to attend both the IAASB and the IAASB CAG meetings. So appreciate.
And I couldn't, having been a former CAG member, I couldn't constrain myself in providing some of my investor or user perspectives as well, because I think it's just such a good moment to sort of, you know, when we talked about materiality or technology or the like. So
thank you for your perspective.
Thanks for allowing me that, indulging me on that.
And wrap up, Tom, do you have any thoughts or anything you'd like to share?
Lots of good food for thought as we go into next week's board meeting. Just again, a huge gratitude for all of you that all of you have joined us, who came here in person, and those who are online, because I'm sure those who are online, many of it's at strange hours of the day. And just we look forward to bringing you together one more time virtually, and also continue to interact. And we know, regardless of who's part of the new SAC, you will all be probably active participants in our process. So thank you, and we'll see you shortly.
Thank you, Tom. Billy, any? The all-important lunch is here, I am told. Thank you for sharing that. And again, I'd like to thank the IAASB staff and support for putting together this meeting. I'd like to thank the task force who presented today. And I'd like to thank everyone here for your participation, both in person, and we had great participation virtually. We're not quite done. December 7th will be our next meeting, and you will get more information in terms of the exact timing of that meeting. So I look forward to seeing everyone on December 7th. And Tom, I look forward to interacting with the board next week. So everyone take care, and we'll talk again in December.
Thank you very much.